Face aux grands défis à venir pour pérenniser la planète Terre et les peuples, est né l'agenda 2030. Cet agenda composé de 17 objectifs à atteindre d'ici 7 ans ambitionne de refaçonner nos sociétés sur tous les plans. Pauvreté, égalité homme-femme, environnement, tout est passé au crible. Comme nous le verrons dans l'émission, certains points suscitent de vives polémiques et dénoncent un recul significatif de nos acquis. Nous tenterons de comprendre quels sont les risques de ce nouvel agenda politique mondial. Bienvenue sur Nouvel Horizon. Avez-vous déjà entendu parler de l'agenda 2030? Nous allons aborder avec vous un sujet qui mobilise beaucoup de matière grise et d'énergie de la part des acteurs opérationnels, scientifiques et politiques dans le monde. Vous vous en doutez déjà, diriger nos sociétés au moyen d'agendas politiques mondiaux est monnaie courante. L'agenda 2030 n'y échappe pas. Ainsi, depuis 2015, l'ONU a adopté un programme de développement durable qui définit 17 objectifs de développement durable, ou ODD pour les intimes, à atteindre d'ici 2030. Les objectifs de cet agenda 2030 sont regroupés en 5 grands thèmes. Les peuples, la planète, la prospérité, la paix et les partenariats. Dans cette émission, nous nous focaliserons sur 3 objectifs qui nous semblent essentiels. Dans un deuxième temps, nous verrons ce que la France met en œuvre pour les atteindre. Débutons avec l'objectif numéro 1 qui ambitionne d'éradiquer la pauvreté de la surface de la Terre. Pour ce faire, plusieurs axes ont été identifiés, comme l'accès à une protection sociale pour tous par exemple, ou encore faire en sorte que chacun ait accès aux services de base. La finalité est claire, diminuer la moitié de la pauvreté simple d'ici 2030. Juste avant, jetons un coup d'œil sur cette répartition du taux d'avancement par ODD pour la France en 2023. Tout ceci semble très ambitieux, mais concrètement, quelles actions avons-nous mises en place dans notre pays pour espérer atteindre ces buts? Et où en sommes-nous à mi-parcours? Eh bien en fait, il y en a eu plusieurs. Prenons par exemple le plan 2013-2017 de lutte contre la pauvreté de l'ODD numéro 1. Il a notamment permis de revaloriser le RSA ou encore d'élargir la couverture maladie universelle complémentaire. Concrètement, il s'agit d'actions qui ont été mises en place afin de rendre plus facile l'accès aux aides sociales. Donc par exemple, le simulateur en ligne appelé Mes droits sociaux, qui permet à toute personne de savoir à quelle prestation sociale elle peut prétendre. Pourtant, malgré tous ces efforts, on constate que le taux de pauvreté en France est stable depuis une vingtaine d'années et ne semble pas connaître de tendance à la baisse. Si nous reprenons le graphique précédent, regardez bien, le cercle du 5 progresse de manière modérée vers l'objectif. Mais nous ne pouvons pas pour autant tirer de conclusions dans les médias. Peut-être que certaines de ces réformes porteront leurs fruits, ceci dans plusieurs années. Rappelons que selon l'OCDE, dans un de ces pays types, il faudrait 5 générations pour que les enfants d'une famille bénéficient du niveau de revenu moyen dans leur pays. Néanmoins, la moitié du temps est déjà passée depuis l'établissement de cet objectif. Les efforts actuels feront-ils sentir leurs fruits suffisamment tôt? Seul l'avenir nous le dira. Donc, voilà pour l'objectif numéro 1. Passons maintenant au deuxième ODD, l'égalité des sexes. Alors, qu'est-il prévu à ce sujet d'ici 2030? La résolution de cet objectif pourrait s'axer sur plusieurs voies possibles, comme la lutte contre les discriminations et le mariage forcé, ou encore la promotion et le partage des travaux domestiques. Et dans ce domaine, tout particulièrement, la France n'a pas chômé. Regardez plutôt. Depuis le 17 août 2015, une loi a été votée qui interdit tout agissement sexiste au travail. Presque un an après, le 13 avril 2016, c'est une loi visant à lutter contre le proxénétisme et à accompagner les prostituées qui voient le jour. Et depuis janvier 2017, dans les conseils d'administration des sociétés cotées, le taux de femmes doit obligatoirement atteindre les 40%. Malgré tous ces efforts, et bien qu'il y ait eu des améliorations, on peut douter raisonnablement du fait que l'objectif sera atteint en 2030. Tenez, il n'y a qu'à voir ce graphique. Même si, entre 2018 et 2020, la proportion de femmes parmi les cadres dirigeants dans le privé a augmenté, nous en sommes pas encore à 50-50. Détail amusant, la part de femmes parmi les cadres dirigeants est autrement plus significative dans le domaine public. Observez ce graphique. On note en jaune que la palme revient à la fonction publique hospitalière. Justement, sans transition, restons dans le domaine de la santé pour aborder le dernier objectif du jour, à savoir assurer un bien-être et une vie saine à tous. Alors bien sûr, là encore, le nombre d'axes envisageables pour agir est immense. Et nous ne les citerons pas tous, ils sont trop nombreux. Mais parmi eux, on trouve notamment l'idée d'une couverture santé universelle, qui serait en vigueur dans le monde entier, mais aussi la volonté de réduire de moitié, à terme, le nombre de décès et de blessures liés aux accidents routiers. Mais ce n'est pas tout. L'ONU espère, d'ici cette date fatidique de 2030, que nous aurons pu mettre fin à l'épidémie de sida, ainsi que du paludisme et de la tuberculose. Malgré la difficulté apparente d'atteindre ces objectifs, notre pays n'est pas effrayé et se veut même un élément moteur. Entre 2011 et 2015, environ 500 millions d'euros ont été investis dans le projet Muskoka, qui a permis de diminuer la mortalité infantile, maternelle et néonatale. Et puis le 26 janvier 2016, la loi de modernisation de notre système de santé a été votée et elle vise très exactement l'atteinte d'un état complet de bien-être physique, mental et social, tel que mis en avant par l'OMS. Sans compter bien évidemment sur le programme national de réduction du tabagisme qui a été mis en place entre 2014 et 2019. Mais concrètement, que disent les chiffres sur la situation actuelle? Eh bien, prenons les accidents de la route pour commencer. Sur ce graphique, nous pouvons constater que le nombre de victimes d'accidents de la route en France était de plus de 3400 en 2015. En 2021, ce nombre a été réduit à environ 3000 et est même passé par un minima aux alentours de 2500 en 2020. Premier abord, ça semble encourageant. Qu'en est-il du tabagisme maintenant? Eh bien en 2016, dans notre pays, quasiment 30% des 18-75 ans fumaient. En 2020, nous approchions des seulement 25%. Sur les trois objectifs de développement durable que nous venons de citer, nous avons pu nous apercevoir de l'évolution concrète des indicateurs pour certains objectifs. D'ailleurs, c'est précisément dans ce sens que l'agenda 2030 a été créé, puisqu'il n'est rien d'autre qu'un complément d'un agenda plus ancien, l'agenda 2021, créé lors du sommet de la Terre à Rio en 1992. Mais si l'agenda 2030 veut dire que ces objectifs sont à atteindre d'ici 2030, la logique n'est pas la même pour l'agenda 2021. En fait, l'agenda 21 définit des objectifs à atteindre à l'échelle du 21e siècle. Et vous en conviendrez probablement, la notion d'urgence climatique semble assez mal se marier avec l'idée d'attendre l'an 2100 pour voir ce qu'il en est. C'est précisément pour cette raison que l'agenda 2030 est né, en donnant des objectifs concrets à moyen terme. Il était censé permettre de créer la dynamique qui nous amènera à atteindre les objectifs de l'agenda 2021. Mais puisque tous ces objectifs visent à transformer nos sociétés, il faut que nous, en tant que citoyens, soyons vigilants. En effet, des outils législatifs puissants vont être donnés pour remplir ces objectifs. Alors, nous devons nous assurer qu'aucun risque pour nos sociétés ne puisse en émerger. Mais évidemment, des risques existent, c'est toujours le cas. Mais quels sont-ils? Pour cela, jetons d'abord un œil sur la situation mondiale à moins de 10 ans de l'échéance de 2030. Eh bien, la zone OCDE ne dépasse pas 28 cibles sur les 112 pour lesquelles il est possible de mesurer ses performances. Et il restait beaucoup à faire en début 2022. Cela fait peu, vous en conviendrez. Si nous faisons le point sur ces 17 objectifs, d'après le rapport récent de 2023 du Conseil économique et social de l'ONU, nous en sommes là. Regardez bien. Comme vous pouvez le constater, en vert se trouvent les objectifs atteints et en jaune, des progrès mais qui nécessitent une amélioration nécessaire. Regardons quand même certains signes encourageants. Par exemple, sur le graphique, ce sont les ODD numéro 1, éliminer la pauvreté dans le monde, et l'ODD numéro 3, bonne santé et bien-être, qui sont en progression en jaune, à comparer avec la couleur rouge, qui reste en stagnation. Malgré ces progrès, les dernières données disponibles montrent que plus d'un résident de l'OCDE sur 9 est considéré comme pauvre en revenus. Le rapport de 2019 pointait déjà un taux de pauvreté dans les zones rurales de plus de 17% et qui était plus de 3 fois supérieur au taux dans les zones urbaines. Si nous nous attardons sur les zones grises des 17 ODD, elles montrent le niveau de difficulté qu'il y a jusqu'à maintenant à obtenir des données actualisées depuis 2015. En fait, c'est le problème majeur rencontré par de nombreux États. À ce jour, les scientifiques ne disposent de données que pour environ 140 des 169 cibles. Ainsi, certaines de ces données ne permettent pas d'apprécier correctement les résultats obtenus jusqu'à présent, ni l'évolution des performances dans le temps. Problématique, n'est-ce pas? Passons sur les ODD où le niveau rouge prédomine largement. sur l'ODD 2. Les estimations actuelles montrent que près de 690 millions de personnes souffrent de la faim, soit près de 9% de la population mondiale, soit une augmentation de près de 60 millions en 5 ans. Un autre élément significatif est celui, à l'échelle mondiale, de l'objectif numéro 8, un travail décent pour tous. Sa barre jaune de progrès ne doit pas faire oublier un point crucial. Il s'agit du ralentissement prévu en 2023 de la croissance du PIB réel par habitant, avec un risque non seulement sur l'emploi et les revenus, mais aussi sur le travail décent pour les jeunes. Devant ce tableau contrasté, ne nous y trompons pas. Pour le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Antonio Guterres, il est temps de tirer la sonnette d'alarme. Il fait d'ailleurs le constat qu'à mi-parcours de la route vers 2030, les objectifs de développement durable sont en grande difficulté. À ce propos, une évaluation des quelques 140 cibles montre qu'environ la moitié de ces cibles sont modérément ou gravement en retard. Et plus de 30% n'ont vu aucun mouvement ou ont régressé en dessous du niveau de référence de 2015. Alors, est-ce que ça suffira d'ici 2030? Assurément non, pour le secrétaire général de l'ONU, qui réclame des mesures urgentes des États dans plusieurs domaines clés comme le renforcement de la cohésion sociale, une meilleure collaboration entre les membres du G20 et le soutien actif en faveur de tous les pays en développement. Même si l'agenda 2030 vise à l'amélioration du cadre de vie des populations pour un avenir plus durable, certaines critiques viennent remettre en question cette vision universelle et inclusive. C'est le cas du chercheur Sergio Belda Miquel de l'Université de Valence, qui met en avant de définir des droits de la personne à respecter plutôt que des objectifs à accomplir. Face à ces promesses en péril, des menaces et craintes cristallisent l'inquiétude de nombreux citoyens. Commençons par celui touchant à la santé, l'objectif numéro 3. Figurez-vous que le groupe international Avocats pour l'éducation, regroupant 10 pays, s'oppose depuis début juillet au traité sur la pandémie proposé par l'OMS. L'un d'entre eux, le docteur Alexander Christ, le dénonce dans un tweet. Pas de nouvel ordre mondial, pas de nouveau gouvernement mondial de la santé conçu par l'OMS. C'est aussi le cas au Parlement européen où le député Rob Roos a dénoncé 3 objectifs de l'agenda 2030. Il a déclaré « L'objectif 13 par exemple, l'action pour le climat conduit à des politiques climatiques radicales. L'objectif 10, réduire les inégalités, ancre l'immigration de masse en Europe. Et l'objectif 5, égalité des genres, transforme l'idéologie du genre en politique gouvernementale. » Vous pouvez soutenir ou combattre ces politiques, mais dans une démocratie, il devrait y avoir un véritable débat à ce sujet. À propos de l'objectif numéro 5 où la France progresse, le sujet fait polémique et provoque la fronde de nombreux collectifs de mères et en particulier de l'un d'eux, les mamans louves. Ce dernier dénonce l'éducation à la sexualité telle qu'elle est prônée par le ministère de l'Éducation dans les écoles et qui ne peut que les perturber sérieusement dans leur développement. Un autre point de discorde est apparu en 2022 sur certaines mesures prises pour enrayer le réchauffement climatique, l'ODD 13. Selon de nombreux experts, si l'on n'y prend pas garde, les politiques soutenues par l'ONU dévasteront l'économie. Et quelles sont les solutions proposées de l'agenda 2030 pour sauver la planète? Une chose est sûre, les choix qui sont déjà préparés pour nous comprennent par exemple l'avènement des véhicules électriques ou encore la réduction de l'exploitation agricole. Ah oui, j'oubliais, nous devrions encore remplacer la viande et les protéines laitières par des insectes. Finalement, vous l'aurez compris, la disponibilité des données est l'une des difficultés les plus marquantes. Elles font obstacle à toute évaluation des progrès et lancement de politiques par les pays. Pour plusieurs objectifs transversaux tels que l'action climatique, l'égalité des sexes et la justice, moins de la moitié des 193 pays disposent de données comparables au niveau international depuis 2015. Le prochain sommet SDG 2023, prévu en septembre à New York, se focalisera d'ailleurs sur les nouvelles orientations politiques pour permettre le lancement d'un nouveau cadre d'action mondiale d'ici 2030. Merci d'avoir suivi Nouvel Horizon, prenez soin les uns des autres et restez libres.
Two, the slaughter of the working class. From Marx's theories to the rhetoric of the totalitarian communist regimes, all were filled with the principle of reliance on the proletarian workers and peasants and promises to represent their interests. But in practice, it was the working class that suffered the greatest abuses under the communist system. A. Suppressing the Soviet workers and peasants. In 1918, after Lenin illegally disbanded the Constituent Assembly, it was the workers who were the first to resist the communist dictatorship. Protesting the dissolution of the assembly, tens of thousands of workers from Petrograd and Moscow held parades and demonstrations. Bolshevik soldiers cracked down on the unrest with lethal force, gunning down demonstrators and filling the streets of Petrograd and Moscow with the workers' blood. The country's largest labor union, the All-Russian Union of Railwaymen, announced a strike to protest the Bolshevik coup and gained the broad support of many other labor organizations. As it did with the workers of Petrograd and Moscow, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union put down the strikers with its armed forces, and the All-Russian Union and other independent unions were banned. Remaining labor organizations were gradually forced under the control of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1919, starving workers in cities across Russia went on strike several times to demand the same rations as Red Army soldiers, the rights to free speech and democratic elections, and the abolition of political privileges afforded to the communists. All these movements were handled by the Cheka secret police, who jailed or shot the strikers. In the summer of 1918, Russia faced a massive food shortage due to the ongoing civil war. In June, with the country on the verge of famine, Lenin dispatched Joseph Stalin to Tsaritsyn to seize grain from the Volga Basin, traditionally a breadbasket of Russian agriculture. The tyranny of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union invited resistance from the peasants. In August 1918, peasants in the Penza region rose up in an armed revolt, and the uprising quickly spread to the surrounding areas. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union sent troops to suppress the uprisings, and Lenin sent a telegram to the Penza Bolsheviks. Here is British historian Robert Service's translation of the original Russian telegram. Hang, and make sure the hanging takes place in full view of the people. No fewer than 100 known landlords, rich men, bloodsuckers. Publish their names. Seize all their grain from them. Designate hostages in accordance with yesterday's telegram. Do it in such a fashion that for hundreds of kilometers around, the people might see, tremble, know, shout. Before the October Revolution, Tambov was one of the richest provinces in Russia. In order to seize its grain, the Soviet Union organized many, quote, grain requisitioning teams and sent them to the region. Over 50,000 Tambov farmers formed local militias to fight the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's requisitioning teams. In June 1921, faced with the task of suppressing the Tambov rebellion, the Soviet regime suggested that military commander Mikhail Tukhachevsky fight the hooligans with poison gas. Tukhachevsky's use of chemical weapons, combined with fires that burned across the region, rendered much of Tambov completely desolate. An estimated 100,000 Tambov peasants who took part in the resistance and their relatives were imprisoned or exiled. Around 15,000 people died in the insurgency. The widespread slaughter in the Soviet Union served as a comprehensive model for the Chinese Communist Party's coming persecution of the Chinese workers and peasants. B. Following the Soviet model. China has a broad and profound culture with a history of 5,000 years. Its people are steeped in a tradition of worshiping gods and revering the divine. The specter of communism, incapable of conquering 5,000 years of tradition using conspiracy alone, dealt with traditional Chinese culture using systematic violence. The Chinese Communist Party targeted the elites of society who served as the bearers of traditional culture, destroyed the physical artifacts of Chinese civilization, and severed the connections between the Chinese people and their gods. China's traditional heritage was replaced with a party culture. to be spread among the survivors of the CCP's mass killings, turning the young into treacherous wolf cubs who serve as the spectre's pawns in the continued destruction of humanity. Immediately after taking power, the CCP began to invent enemies, beginning with the murder of elites. In the countryside, it slaughtered landlords and gentry. In the cities, it killed businessmen, creating an atmosphere of terror and looting the wealth of civil society. To rouse the peasants to kill landlords and rich farmers and support the new communist regime, the CCP implemented a so-called land reform that promised the peasantry their own land. But after murdering the landowners, the CCP claimed the land was to be turned over to the peasants in the form of cooperatives. In practice, this meant the land still did not belong to the peasants. In March 1950, the CCP issued the Directive on the Strict Suppression of Counter-Revolutionary Elements, also known as the Campaign to Suppress Counter-Revolutionaries, which focused on killing the landlords and rich peasants in the countryside. The CCP announced that by the end of 1952, more than 2.4 million counter-revolutionaries had been eliminated. In fact, more than 5 million people, accounting for nearly 1% of the total Chinese population, had been murdered. After killing the landlords and rich peasants in the countryside, the CCP launched the 3 anti and 5 anti campaigns to slaughter wealthy city dwellers. In Shanghai alone, 876 people committed suicide during the movement from January to April 1951, according to incomplete statistics. Among them, many capitalists committed suicide with all of their family members. The CCP did not stop with the extermination of landlords and capitalists. It also robbed the wealth of peasants, small merchants, and craftsmen. After the mass slaughter, the vast majority of the working class remained impoverished. Three, the absolute brutality of the Communist Party. A. Atrocities of Soviet communism. The gulags, inspiration for Hitler's death camps. On September 5, 1918, Lenin ordered the establishment of the first Soviet concentration camp on the Solovetsky Islands for the incarceration, torture, and slaughter of political prisoners and dissidents who opposed the October Revolution. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union followed this up with a constellation of concentration camps across the Soviet Union, the notorious Gulag labor camps of the Stalinist era. The Gulag system, the term Gulag being an abbreviation in Russian for the main administration of corrective labor camps and settlements, grew to a monstrous scale under the leadership of Stalin as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union intensified its political terror and carried out even greater purges. By the time of Stalin's death in 1953, there were 170 Gulag administrations containing over 30,000 individual camps scattered across the Soviet Union, in what Alexander Solzhenitsyn would famously describe as the Gulag Archipelago in his book by the same name. In his documentary work, Solzhenitsyn listed 31 different methods that the Soviet secret police used to exhaust their prisoners' strength and force them to confess to any crime. Those sent to the Gulag suffered from a constant shortage of food and clothing while being forced to perform heavy labor 12 to 16 hours a day in the freezing cold of Russian winters. The death toll was enormous. Many people were imprisoned along with their entire families, with husbands incarcerated and wives exiled. Not even the elderly, some already in their 80s, were spared. The condemned ranged from high-ranking party elites, state leaders, and military commanders, down to completely ordinary citizens from every walk of life, including religious believers, engineers, technicians, doctors, students, professors, factory workers, and peasants. It is common for people to believe that concentration camps were a Nazi creation, but in reality, the Soviet Gulag system was the precursor to similar forms of repression around the world in both communist and non-communist regimes. According to former Soviet military intelligence officer and popular historian Viktor Suvorov, Before World War II, Hitler sent Gestapo officers to Russia to tour and study the experiences accumulated by the Soviets in building the Gulag. According to conservative estimates, over 500,000 prisoners perished in the Gulag system between 1930 and 1940, during the years of Stalin's pre-war terror. The system was disbanded in 1960. In 2013, a website of the Russian state media reported that more than 15 million people had been sentenced and imprisoned in the Gulag labor camps, and more than 1.5 million had died. Killing by famine. Communist regimes often killed people through famine. Between 1932 and 1933, the Ukrainian region suffered from a genocidal mass starvation, known as the Holodomor, caused by the Soviet regime. After the Civil War, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's forced collective farming met with widespread resistance from the Ukrainian peasantry. To deal with this, the Soviet regime classified a majority of skilled farmers as kulaks and exiled them to Western Siberia and the republics of Central Asia. The removal of the kulaks was a huge loss to Ukrainian agriculture, and in 1932, production plummeted. In the winter of 1932 to 1933, the Soviet government cut off food supplies to Ukraine and set up security fences along the borders of the republic. At first, Ukrainians survived on the stored vegetables and potatoes in their homes, but these were soon requisitioned by party authorities. A large number of farmers starved to death. In desperation, people turned to eating the dug-up carcasses of cats, dogs, and livestock, and even cannibalism. The authorities prevented villagers from traveling to the cities in search of food. Many people starved to death as they walked along the railways. The Holodomor famine turned more than 1 million Ukrainian children into orphans. Many of them became homeless and had no choice but to beg for food in the cities. To eliminate this embarrassment, Stalin signed orders authorizing police to shoot children as young as 12. Estimates of the death toll during the Holodomor range from about 2.5 million to 4.8 million. During the famine, bodies of the victims could be seen all over the streets of Kharkov, the Ukrainian capital. The Great Terror turns on the Soviet elite. The purpose of the communist spectre is to destroy all of mankind, including, eventually, its own followers. This played out during the Stalinist era, as the Communist Party of the Soviet Union carried out bloody purges across its own ranks. Beginning in 1928, Stalin targeted the upper echelons of the communist leadership. Out of the 1,966 delegates to the 17th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1934, 1,108 were arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. Of the 139 members of the Central Committee elected at the 17th Congress, 4 out of every 5 were shot. The Soviet Politburo had elected 31 members between 1919 and 1935, of whom 20 were killed in Stalin's purges. Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's secret police chief, once said, "Show me the man, and I'll find you the crime." Except for Stalin, all of the Politburo members remaining at the time of Lenin's death in 1924, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, Alexei Rykov, Mikhail Tomsky, and Leon Trotsky, were executed or assassinated by 1940. No section of society was spared in the Great Terror. Repression in the religious, scientific, educational, academic, and artistic fields preceded the purges that gutted the military and political elite. The main victims of Stalin's terror were ordinary Soviet citizens. How many were arrested, killed, imprisoned, or exiled by Stalin in the Great Terror? Even today, there are no complete records or answers. On the eve of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in June 1991, KGB chief Vladimir Kryuchkov said that between 1920 and 1953, about 4.2 million people were, quote, suppressed, including 2 million during the Great Terror alone. Alexander Yakovlev, a reformist politician in the Soviet and Yeltsin eras, said in a 2000 interview, that the victims of the Stalinist repression numbered at least 20 million. B. Atrocities of the Chinese Communist Party. From 1949, the year the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, regime was established, to 1966, tens of millions of Chinese lost their lives in the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, the 3 anti- and 5 anti-campaigns, the anti-rightist campaign, and the Great Famine caused by the Great Leap Forward. This period was followed by bloody struggles within the CCP. As a new generation of Chinese, raised to be atheist wolf cubs, indoctrinated in the education and party culture of communism, came of age, the communist spectre launched a campaign of even more rampant killing and destruction to wipe out 5,000 years worth of traditional Chinese culture. The Great Chinese Famine. Between 1959 and 1962, China experienced the world's deadliest famine. To deceive the world, the CCP still claims it was, quote, 3 years of natural disasters. In fact, in 1958, the CCP had rashly begun the People's Commune movement and the Great Leap Forward campaign. These wild schemes, which depleted grain stocks and decimated Chinese agricultural production, were supported by a deluge of false reports written by officials across all levels of leadership, from rural regions to the cities. The CCP used these reports as justification for collecting grain from the peasants, who were forced to turn in their food, seeds, and animal feed to the regime. The CCP's administrative organs at all levels sent teams to the countryside. They used torture and interrogations to squeeze the last morsels of food from the doomed peasants. Following the example set by the Soviet communists, the CCP prevented villagers from entering cities in search of food, causing the mass death of families and even whole villages. Cannibalism was widespread, and the corpses of famine victims littered the countryside. When peasants were caught stealing to survive, they were killed. The grain seized by the government was traded for large amounts of Soviet weaponry, or for gold that the CCP used to pay off debts, as it turned a blind eye to the loss of Chinese lives. In just 3 years, the Great Chinese Famine had wiped out tens of millions of people. The Cultural Revolution's fanatical slaughter and cultural genocide. On May 16, 1996, the CCP published the Notice of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which marked the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. In August, with the children of high-ranking CCP cadres leading the way, students from secondary schools in Beijing formed a band of Red Guards. The mob went on a rampage across Beijing in a frenzy of ransacking, assault, and killing. By the end of the month, known as Red August, thousands of people in Beijing had been murdered. In the Beijing district of Daxing, 325 people were killed in 6 days, between August 27th and September 1st, across 48 production brigades of 13 people's communes. The dead varied in age from just 38 days to 80 years, and 22 families were wiped out completely. The Red Guards beat their victims with clubs, as well as stabbed or strangled them. They killed infants and toddlers by stepping on one leg and tearing the child in two. As the specter of communism directed people to beat and kill, it erased their human compassion, brainwashing them with the slogan of, quote, treating the enemy with the numb cruelty of the harsh winter. With every crime against humanity, the CCP displaced the traditional culture and moral virtue of the Chinese. Poisoned by party culture, many people became tools of murder. When most people see or learn about the bloodthirsty deeds of the totalitarian communist state, they are at a complete loss as to how anyone could descend into such inhuman barbarism. The truth behind this is that they were possessed by rotten demons and degenerate spirits controlled by the communist specter. Estimating the ravages of the Cultural Revolution is a daunting task. Most studies suggest a minimum death toll of 2 million. R.J. Rummel, an American professor who has researched mass killing, wrote in his book China's Bloody Century that the Cultural Revolution claimed the lives of 7.73 million people. Dong Baoshun, an associate professor of China's Shandong University, and Ding Longjia, deputy director of the Shandong Party History Research Office, co-authored a 1997 book titled Exonerate the Innocent, Rehabilitate the Wrongly Accused and Sentenced. It quoted Ye Jianying, the vice president of the CCP Central Committee, as making the following statements during the closing ceremony of the Central Working Conference on December 13, 1978. Quote, 2 years and 7 months of comprehensive investigation by the Central Committee have determined that 20 million people died in the Cultural Revolution. Over 100 million suffered political persecution, and 800 billion yuan were wasted. According to the selected works of Deng Xiaoping from August 21st to 23rd, 1980, CCP leader Deng Xiaoping gave 2 interviews with Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci in the Great Hall of the People. Fallaci asked, quote, "How many people died in the Cultural Revolution?" Deng replied, quote, "How many people really died in the Cultural Revolution? The figure is astronomical and can never be estimated." Deng described a typical case. Kang Sheng, the head of the CCP's secret police, accused the party secretary of Yunnan province, Zhao Jianmin, of treason and of being an agent of the Kuomintang. Not only was Zhao imprisoned, but his downfall also impacted 1.38 million people throughout the province, of whom 17,000 were persecuted to death and 60,000 were beaten to the point of disability. Unprecedented evil, the persecution of Falun Gong. Decades of murderous violence and atheist indoctrination by the Chinese Communist Party have taken a massive toll on the moral fabric of society, bringing it far below the standards gods require of humanity. Even many of those who still believe in gods are ignorant of genuine faith, since they are trapped in the sham religious organizations controlled by the CCP. Should the situation continue to degenerate, humanity will face certain extinction, as prophesied in the holy texts of every ancient civilization. During the spring of 1992, to restore human morality and provide a path to salvation, Mr. Li Hongzhi taught Falun Gong, also called Falun Dafa, a spiritual practice based on belief in the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Uncomplicated to learn, Falun Gong spread across China in a few short years. As practitioners, along with their relatives and peers, experienced miracles of improved health and character, tens of millions of people took up the practice in China and around the world. With so many people practicing cultivation in Falun Gong and holding themselves to higher standards, society began to rediscover its moral bearings. But the specter of communism is bent on preventing man from being saved by the Creator. For this reason, it destroyed traditional cultures and corrupted human moral values. Naturally, it sees Falun Gong as its greatest adversary. In July 1999, then CCP leader Jiang Zemin unilaterally ordered the systematic persecution of Falun Gong and its practitioners. In a brutal campaign that covered every corner of China, the CCP applied every method imaginable in its efforts to fulfill Jiang's directive. Quote, "Kill them physically, bankrupt them financially, and ruin their reputations." Party mouthpieces subjected the Chinese people to constant propaganda filled with hatred and slander of Falun Gong, rejecting its principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance in favor of falsehood, wickedness, and struggle. The evil specter brought society to new lows in moral degeneration. In an atmosphere of hatred and repression reactivated from dormancy, the Chinese people turned a blind eye to the persecution happening around them, betraying Buddhas and gods. Some sacrificed their conscience and participated in the campaign against Falun Gong, ignorant of the fact that they had damned themselves in the process. The communist specter did not limit the persecution to China. It silenced the nations of the free world, while the Chinese regime engaged in the frenzied jailing, murder, and torture of Falun Gong practitioners. Essentially bribed with economic incentives, the free world took in the party's lies, giving the persecutors free rein to commit the worst crimes. In the persecution of Falun Gong, the CCP introduced an evil never before seen: live organ harvesting. As the largest group of people imprisoned for their faith in China, Falun Gong practitioners are killed on demand, cut open on the operating tables of state and military hospitals, and their organs are sold for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. On July 7, 2006, Canadian lawyers David Matas and David Kilgour, former Canadian Secretary of State Asia-Pacific, published a report titled Bloody Harvest: The Killing of Falun Gong for Their Organs. Examining 18 types of evidence, they shed light on the CCP's monstrosity, calling it, quote, a disgusting form of evil new to this planet. Matas and Kilgour, working with international investigators, published the report An Update to the Slaughter and Bloody Harvest in June 2016. Running over 680 pages and containing more than 2,400 references, it proved beyond any doubt the reality and scale of the live organ harvesting carried out by the Chinese Communist regime. On June 13, 2016, the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously passed Resolution 343, demanding the CCP bring an immediate end to the forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners and other prisoners of conscience. The lucrative organ transplant business sustained support for the persecution of Falun Gong and attracted clients from China and around the world, making them part of the CCP's mass murder. 4. Red Terror in Export. The introduction to the Black Book of Communism provides a rough estimate of the death tolls of communist regimes around the world. It verified a figure of 94 million, including the following: 20 million in the Soviet Union, 65 million in China, 1 million in Vietnam, 2 million in North Korea, 2 million in Cambodia, 1 million in Eastern Europe, 150,000 in Latin America, mainly Cuba, 1.7 million in Ethiopia, 1.5 million in Afghanistan, 10,000 due to, quote, the international communist movement and communist parties not in power. Apart from Russia and China, lesser communist regimes have shown themselves no less willing to engage in absolute evil. The Cambodian genocide is the most extreme mass murder carried out by a communist government. According to various estimates, the number of Cambodians killed by Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime ranges from 1.4 million to 2.2 million, up to one-third of Cambodia's population at the time. Between 1948 and 1987, the North Korean communists killed more than 1 million of their own people through forced labor, executions, and internment in concentration camps. In the 1990s, famine killed between 240,000 and 420,000 people. In total, 600,000 to 800,000 North Koreans are thought to have died unnatural deaths between 1993 and 2008. After Kim Jong-un came to power, he committed more overt murders, with the victims including high-ranking officials and his own relatives. Kim has also threatened the world with nuclear war. In just 1 century, since the rise of the first communist regime in Russia, the evil specter of communism has murdered more people in the nations under its rule than the combined death toll of both world wars. The history of communism is a history of murder, and every page is written in the blood of its victims.
Is Barbie secretly a communist? Elon Musk's mother models for a Chinese tech company. And Hong Kong places a bounty on 8 people overseas. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Surfshark. Whenever you go online, you should be using a VPN like Surfshark to cover your tracks and protect your identity. I'll tell you more at the end. Is Barbie a communist? After all, pink is only a shade away from red. And believe me, that won't be the stupidest thing you hear today, because the Barbie movie has been banned in Vietnam. It's because of this map. You see those dotted lines next to Asia? Apparently, the Vietnamese government thought that was showing China's 9-dash line, China's absurd claim to basically everything in sight, including the waters around Vietnam. So yes, the Vietnam government saw this and thought it was clearly making a political statement. By the way, the Barbie map only has 8 dashes. They couldn't even do their research right. But speaking of movies in China, the Pentagon is cracking down on Hollywood studios that try to appease China. According to the new rules, the DoD will not provide production assistance if a movie complies with a demand from China, especially censorship. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering, what work does the Department of Defense do with Hollywood anyway? Besides possibly making the next live-action G.I. Joe film, that is. I mean, there's apparently a Barbie movie, so why not? What's that, Shelley? They already have a G.I. Joe film franchise? We officially live in the weirdest timeline. Anyway, according to Politico, the Pentagon has allowed filmmakers to shoot their projects on military bases, Navy ships, or other locations and weigh in on filmmaking processes. The military benefits from positive portrayals of service members, and movie makers benefit from authentic settings and technical expertise. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in China. Right before she left, she talked on the phone with China's ambassador to the U.S., Xie Feng. The U.S. called it a frank and productive discussion about issues of concern for the U.S. And there are plenty of concerns. The call came just as China imposed export restrictions on 2 metals used in semiconductors and solar panels. China didn't say why it imposed the restrictions, but many see it as retaliation for the U.S. putting restrictions on microchips being sold to China. While we don't know if they discussed the metal restrictions, the timing makes it seem likely. And after the break, is China using Elon Musk's mom to gain influence? Welcome back. Is China trying to buy more Musk influence? That's a question floating around after it was revealed that his mother, May Musk, who's a model, signed a contract with Chinese tech company Oppo to be the brand ambassador to its Find X6 Pro smartphone. The South China Morning Post got leaked videos and photos showing May Musk promoting the smartphone. In the video, she shares photos of her 3 kids and says this:
"I hope it takes them to space and beyond."
As of this recording, Oppo hasn't officially released the commercial or any of the photos associated with the leak. But the Musks certainly are making a good deal of money off the China market. Hong Kong has put a bounty on the heads of 8 Hong Kong democracy activists. Hong Kong police announced on Monday a bounty of $1 million Hong Kong, which is about 120,000 US dollars per person. The activists were accused of violating Hong Kong's very vague national security law, which was imposed by Beijing in 2020. The crazy thing about that law is it applies to everyone anywhere in the world. The 8 people currently reside across Australia, the UK, and the US, which have each condemned Hong Kong's efforts to silence dissidents. I doubt these countries will extradite them. However, they do need to be careful when they travel to other countries in case those countries do have extradition treaties with China. Hong Kong's chief executive John Lee said the 8 activists would be pursued for life. And speaking of John Lee, there's a bit of conflict over Lee traveling to the U.S. Lee has been sanctioned by the U.S. since 2020 for his role as Hong Kong's Secretary of Security. But there's an APEC meeting in San Francisco this November, and China has made it clear it wants Lee to go, despite the sanctions. There was some confusion after the State Department told Congress he would be invited. It later walked that back, but remained ambiguous about whether it would invite him in the future. Several U.S. lawmakers and activist groups have asked the State Department to make sure he doesn't come. I say the U.S. should strike a deal with him. He can come to APEC if Hong Kong drops all its national security law charges. That would mean about 260 people arrested in Hong Kong, as well as all those wanted outside Hong Kong, would have their charges dropped. That way, the U.S. will be standing up for democracy, and Lee will get his symbolic visit to the U.S. Win-win. Now, this will shock you, but apparently big banks are kind of scummy. U.S. and UK lawmakers are accusing the bank HSBC of preventing people fleeing Hong Kong from getting their money. HSBC has said it's just complying with local laws. You know, the kind of laws that say democracy activists will be pursued for life. And after the break, the EU is cutting trade ties with China. Welcome back. The U.S. is concerned over China's influence in UNESCO. So much so, the U.S. has decided to rejoin. The U.S. got approved last Friday after a majority of members voted in favor of letting the U.S. back in. And now that it's back, China is warning the U.S. against confrontation and divisions. The U.S. pulled out of UNESCO under the Trump administration in 2018. It cited problems with members not paying, bias against Israel, and the need for reform. But the EU may be finally wising up on China. They've agreed in principle to a de-risking strategy on China. Leaders from the 27-country bloc were united around the concept, but the details still have to be hammered out. After how Europe got burned because it was dependent on energy from Russia last year, Europe is trying to avoid a similar situation with China, especially since China continually threatens to invade Taiwan and start World War III. And this episode has been sponsored by Surfshark. Whenever you go online, everything you do is being tracked and logged by the websites you visit and your internet service provider, and in many cases, by your government. That's why no matter where you live or what you do online, you should always be keeping your internet activity private with a VPN. And now, Surfshark has servers you can connect to in over 100 countries. That's more than any other VPN. So that makes your connection faster and more reliable. Plus, Surfshark has top-of-the-line encryption and a no-logs policy, meaning they don't collect your browsing data. In fact, Surfshark was rated Editor's Choice for the best VPN for privacy and security by PC Mag. So check out Surfshark. With just one Surfshark account, you can connect as many devices as you want. So try it out now. Surfshark has a special deal that includes 83% off a 2-year plan, plus 3 extra months for free. You can protect yourself for just $2.21 a month. So go to surfshark.com/uncensored and use the code UNCENSORED to secure this deal. The link is in the description below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.
Durant la dynastie des Qing vivait un paysan riche mais pas très intelligent, à tel point qu'il était surnommé « objet débile » par les autres. Il n'était pas très doué pour gérer ses richesses, mais ne les perdait jamais. Il ne prenait pas grand soin de sa santé, mais ne tombait pas malade. Lorsqu'il rencontrait occasionnellement des soucis, ces derniers pouvaient toujours s'arranger d'une manière inattendue. Une telle chose lui était arrivée. Une fois, l'une de ses servantes s'est pendue. Les petits fonctionnaires malveillants du village s'en sont réjouis. En exagérant l'affaire, ils la rapportèrent à l'administration pour pouvoir se moquer de ce riche paysan. Les responsables, avec de mauvaises intentions, furent impatients également d'aller les rejoindre. Une fois les gens arrivés, au moment d'examiner le corps de la servante, ses membres se mirent à frémir, à la surprise de tout le monde. Alors que les gens se demandaient ce qu'il se passait, elle se mit à bâiller, à s'étirer, puis se retourna et se leva. La servante, que tout le monde croyait morte, revenait à la vie. Ne voulant pas laisser passer l'occasion d'intimider le paysan, les fonctionnaires malveillants cherchèrent alors à l'accuser d'agression envers la servante. Ils essayèrent de pousser cette dernière à témoigner ainsi contre son maître. La servante se prosterna et dit : « L'épouse et les concubines de mon maître sont toutes belles et élégantes. Comment serait-il possible qu'il s'intéresse à une pauvre servante comme moi ? Si une chose pareille se produisait, je serais vraiment contente. Pourquoi devrais-je me suicider ? La réalité est que mon père a été torturé à mort par le gouvernement sans aucune raison. C'est cette douleur insurmontable qui m'a poussé au suicide, et pas autre chose. » Désemparés par ces paroles, les fonctionnaires finirent par partir. Des malheurs de ce genre qui arrivaient à ce riche paysan s'étaient souvent arrangés de cette manière imprévue. Les villageois ne comprenaient pas pourquoi un homme si bête était tellement béni par le ciel. Quelqu'un avait essayé de se renseigner auprès d'un ensorceleur à propos de ce riche paysan. « Ne comprenez-vous pas ?» dit l'ensorceleur. « Sa stupidité est à l'origine de tous ses bonheurs. » Il poursuivit. Dans sa vie antérieure, cet homme avait été un vieux villageois, honnête et bienveillant. Il ne calculait pas ses gains et ses pertes. Il ne détestait personne et avait toujours été généreux. Lorsque les autres l'insultaient, il ne leur avait pas rendu la même chose. Lorsque les autres le trompaient, il n'avait pas non plus eu l'esprit de vengeance. Attaqué ou blessé, il ne se faisait pas de soucis. Ainsi, bien qu'il soit maigre et mort dans l'obscurité, son gentil caractère a été apprécié par les divinités, ce qui lui a permis d'avoir cette vie actuelle pleine de bonheur. Malgré son apparence débile, il a toujours gardé en lui sa nature bienveillante. Ayant trouvé cette histoire captivante, Ji Xiaolan, un grand littéraire de la dynastie Qing, l'avait inscrite dans son œuvre « Note de la chaumière des observations subtiles ».